The town of Willow Creek woke slowly each morning, wrapped in golden sunlight and the distant hum of cattle across open fields. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and more importantly, their place, and Eliza Carter knew hers all too well. She stood just outside the old wooden fence of her family's ranch, her hands rough from years of work, her dress simple and faded from sun and dust. A loose strand of brown hair brushed against her cheek as she leaned forward, tightening a wire that had come loose overnight. These small repairs were part of her daily routine, quiet tasks that often went unnoticed, much like her. From inside the house, laughter floated through the open window. Clara. Eliza didn't need to look to know what was happening. Her younger sister was likely standing in front of the mirror, trying on yet another ribbon or dress, preparing for the town social that evening. Clara had a way of filling every room she entered, bright, effortless. Admired. Eliza straightened up and wiped her hands on her apron. For a moment, she glanced toward the house. Clara had always been the one people noticed first. Where Clara was radiant and lively, Eliza was reserved and practical. Where Clara was praised, Eliza was expected. It wasn't something anyone said out loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way people greeted them, the way conversations shifted, the way eyes lingered. Or didn't, Eliza? Clara's voice rang out, light and impatient. Are you coming in, or are you planning to spend the whole day with the fence? Eliza allowed herself a faint smile and stepped toward the house. I'm coming, she replied softly. Inside, the contrast was even clearer. Clara stood near the window, sunlight catching the soft curls in her hair, a pale blue dress flowing perfectly around her. She turned, holding up a ribbon. Do you think this looks better, or the white one? She asked, tilting her head. Eliza paused, taking in the image. Clara didn't ask out of insecurity. She already knew she looked beautiful. It was simply part of her nature to be seen. The blue suits you, Eliza said. Clara smiled, pleased. I thought so too. There was no malice in her tone, no cruelty. Just certainty. Eliza moved past her, heading toward the kitchen. There were chores to finish, animals to check, bread to prepare before the evening came. The town social wasn't something she looked forward to. It never had been. Still, she would go. She always did, because not going would mean answering questions. And sometimes that felt harder than simply standing quietly in a crowded room where no one noticed her anyway. By late afternoon, Willow Creek began to transform. Lanterns were strung across the main street, music drifted through the air, and people gathered in their finest clothes. Eliza arrived beside Clara, her own dress modest and neatly pressed, though far simpler. As they stepped into the lively scene, the difference between them became immediate. Clara! Voices called out warmly. Compliments followed her dress, her smile, her presence. Eliza walked just a step behind, unnoticed but not invisible. People nodded politely, offering brief greetings before their attention returned to Clara. She didn't resent it. Not anymore. Over the years, she had learned to exist within the spaces left for her, to find comfort in quiet moments, in meaningful work, in being reliable rather than remarkable. Still, there were moments when she wondered what it might feel like to be chosen first. As the evening carried on, Eliza found her usual place near the edge of the gathering. She helped an older woman adjust her shawl, refilled empty cups, and kept to the background where she felt most at ease. Then a shift rippled through the crowd. It was subtle at first, voices lowering, heads turning. Eliza, someone whispered nearby. He's here. She didn't need to ask who. Ethan Hayes, the wealthiest rancher in the county. Respected, admired, and, if rumors were to be believed, searching for a wife. Naturally, everyone assumed Clara would be his choice. Eliza didn't even consider the idea. She kept her gaze lowered, adjusting a cup on the table as the sound of boots approached across the wooden floor. This was Clara's moment. It always was. And Eliza was perfectly content staying where she belonged, just outside the spotlight, where expectations couldn't reach her. Or so she thought, because this night, something was about to change. The music softened as Ethan Hayes stepped into the lantern-lit hall, his presence carrying a quiet authority that didn't need announcing. Conversations dipped into murmurs and heads turned almost instinctively. He wasn't just wealthy, though everyone knew he owned more land than most men in Willow Creek combined. It was something else. A steadiness. A reputation built not on charm, but on integrity. Clara noticed him immediately. Her posture straightened, her smile brightening as though the evening had been waiting for this exact moment. Around her, a few other women adjusted their dresses, their laughter turning just a little more deliberate, their voices sweeter. Eliza noticed too, but only in the way one notices a storm rolling in from a distance. A shift in the air. A change in the room. She kept her attention on the table in front of her, carefully arranging cups that didn't need arranging. This wasn't her story. It never was. Ethan exchanged a few greetings near the entrance, his voice calm, his nod respectful. Men shook his hand. Women watched him with quiet anticipation, and then, slowly, his gaze began to move across the room. It passed over groups of people, over bright dresses and eager smiles, until it stopped on Clara. For a brief second, everything seemed to align exactly as the town expected. Clara met his gaze with confidence, offering a warm, practiced smile that had won over nearly everyone she had ever met, but Ethan didn't step forward. Instead, his eyes moved on. Clara's smile faltered, just slightly, so small that most wouldn't notice, but Eliza did, because Ethan's attention had shifted again, toward the edge of the room, toward her. Eliza felt it before she fully understood it, that unmistakable awareness of being seen, not glanced at, not passed over. Seen. Her hands stilled. No, she thought quietly. Not me, but the sound of boots against wood grew closer. One step, then another. The conversations around her began to quiet, like wind settling before something unexpected. Eliza slowly lifted her gaze. Ethan Hayes stood just a few feet away. Up close, he seemed even more composed than she'd imagined. His expression wasn't curious or amused. There was no hint of mockery or obligation, only certainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eliza's heart beat unevenly, not from excitement, but from confusion. Surely this was a mistake. Perhaps. He meant to greet someone behind her. She took a small step back, instinctively making room. Ethan stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and steady. Her breath caught. He knew her name. Eliza hesitated, her voice softer than she intended. "You must be looking for my sister." A few nearby heads tilted, listening more closely now. Ethan's expression didn't change. "No," he replied simply. The word hung in the air. "No," he repeated, a touch gentler this time. "I was hoping to speak with you." A ripple moved through the room, whispers beginning to rise like wind through dry grass. Clara stood frozen across the hall, her expression unreadable, though her stillness said enough. Eliza felt every eye turned toward her. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. "I think," she began, searching for the right words. "You might be mistaken." Ethan shook his head once. "I don't believe I am." Silence pressed in around them. Then, after a brief pause, he extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" The question felt unreal, like something meant for someone else, spoken in the wrong direction. Eliza stared at his hand, unsure whether accepting it would mean stepping into something she couldn't understand, or refusing it would mean retreating back into the quiet safety she had always known. Her first instinct was to decline. To disappear. To let the world return to its familiar shape. But something in his expression stopped her. There was no pressure in it, no expectation, only patience. As though he would accept whatever answer she gave, but genuinely hoped she would say yes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her hand. "All right," she said softly. The moment their hands met, a quiet gasp passed through the room. Ethan guided her toward the center of the floor, not with showmanship, but with calm assurance. The music swelled again, hesitant at first, then steady. Eliza became acutely aware of everything: the warmth of his hand, the rhythm of the music, the weight of every gaze fixed upon them. "I'm not very good at this," she admitted quietly. "That's all right," Ethan replied. "Neither am I." There was a faint hint of a smile in his voice. They moved slowly. Carefully, two people finding rhythm not just in the music, but in the moment itself. Around them, the town watched in stunned silence, because this wasn't just unexpected. It was unthinkable. The wealthy cowboy had walked past every obvious choice, and chosen the sister no one ever chose. And as Eliza turned gently beneath the soft glow of lantern light, she realized something even more unsettling than the attention itself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing at the edge of the room. The morning after the social arrived quietly, as if the town itself was unsure how to begin again. Eliza woke before sunrise, as she always did. The rhythm of ranch life didn't wait for confusion or unanswered questions. Animals still needed feeding, fences still needed mending. The world, it seemed, expected her to carry on exactly as before. So she did. By the time the first light stretched across the fields, she was already outside, moving through her chores with practiced ease. The cool air brushed against her face as she worked, grounding her in something familiar. Out here, things made sense. Hard work had clear results. Effort mattered. Quiet didn't mean invisible, it meant peaceful. But even in that stillness, her thoughts refused to settle. The memory of the night before lingered. Ethan's voice, steady and certain. The way he had said her name. The way he had looked at her as though she belonged in that moment, just as much as anyone else. It didn't feel like pity. That was what unsettled her most. Eliza! The voice came from behind her, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned. Clara stood near the fence, her expression composed, though there was a trace of hesitation in her posture. "You're up early," Clara said. "I always am," Eliza replied gently. A brief silence followed. Clara stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "People are still talking," she said, "about last night." Eliza gave a small nod. "I figured they would." "They don't understand it," Clara added, her tone careful. "Neither do I," Eliza admitted. Clara studied her for a moment, as if searching for something, an answer, perhaps, or a sign that things hadn't truly changed. "Well," she said finally, forcing a lighter tone, "I'm sure it will pass." "These things usually do?" Eliza wanted to believe that. She really did. But something in her chest told her this wouldn't fade as easily as gossip usually did. Clara gave a small smile and turned back toward the house, leaving Eliza alone once more. The morning stretched on, steady and predictable, until it wasn't. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the quiet. Eliza straightened, her hands pausing mid-task as she looked toward the dirt road. A single rider approached, framed by the rising sun. Even at a distance, she recognized him. Her breath caught. Ethan Hayes. He slowed his horse as he reached the fence, dismounting with an ease that spoke of long years spent in the saddle. For a moment he simply stood there, as though giving her the chance to turn away if she wished. She didn't. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the sudden shift in her pulse. A brief silence settled between them, not awkward, but thoughtful. "I hope I'm not intruding," he added. "You're not," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "We don't usually get visitors this early." Ethan nodded slightly. "I thought it might be quieter." Eliza almost smiled at that. "It is," she said. "Most people prefer later hours." "I've never been most people," he replied simply. There was no arrogance in the statement, just quiet truth. Eliza gestured toward the fence. "What brings you here?" Ethan stepped closer, resting his hands lightly against the wood. "I wanted to see you," he said. The honesty of it caught her off guard. "Not I was passing by." "Not I had business nearby." Just the truth. Eliza lowered her gaze briefly, unsure how to respond. "After last night," he continued, "I imagine you have questions." "That's one way to put it," she said softly. "And you deserve answers." She looked up at him then, searching his expression for anything that might hint at uncertainty or hidden intent. But there was none, only calm. "Why?" she asked. It was a simple word, but it carried everything she hadn't been able to say. Why me? Why in front of everyone? Why step into a moment that changed everything? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted briefly to the fence she had been repairing, to the tools at her side, to the small details most people overlooked. Then he looked back at her. "I've seen you before," he said. Eliza blinked, surprised. "You have?" "Many times," he replied. "You just didn't notice." She frowned slightly, trying to recall any moment that might explain it. "At the market," he continued. "At church, out here working when others were resting." Eliza felt a quiet shift inside her. "You remember those things?" she asked. "I notice what matters," he said. The words settled between them, heavier than they first appeared. "I've seen how you carry yourself," Ethan went on. "How you help without being asked. How you keep going when no one's watching." Eliza swallowed, unsure what to do with the weight of his attention. "Those aren't things people usually care about," she said. "Then they're looking at the wrong things," he replied. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the space between them. No whispers. No expectations. Just truth. "I didn't choose you to surprise anyone," Ethan added quietly. "I chose you because you're the kind of person I respect." Eliza's chest tightened, not from doubt this time, but from something unfamiliar. Being seen. Not for what she lacked, but for what she had always been. She looked away briefly, taking a breath as she tried to steady herself. "This is a lot," she admitted. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you for anything today." She glanced back at him, surprised. "I just wanted you to know," he continued, "that last night wasn't a mistake." The certainty in his voice left no room for misunderstanding. For the first time since the dance, something inside Eliza began to settle. Not completely, but enough. "All right," she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod as though that was enough. "For now, I'll let you get back to your work," he said. Stepping away from the fence, Eliza watched as he returned to his horse. Mounting with the same quiet ease, he paused once more before turning. "I'll come by again," he said. It wasn't a question, and somehow she didn't mind. As he rode off, the morning seemed different than it had before. Not louder. Not brighter. Just changed. Eliza looked down at her hands, still rough from work. Still familiar. But for the first time, she wondered if they told a different story than she had always believed, because someone had finally looked at her and seen something worth choosing. By the time the next Sunday arrived, Willow Creek had already made up its mind, not all at once, not in any formal way, but in glances, in whispers, in the quiet reshaping of conversations that stopped just a moment too late when Eliza walked by. People were no longer simply curious, they were watching, and when Ethan Hayes stepped beside Eliza outside the small white church that morning, that quiet attention sharpened into something undeniable. It was the first time they had arrived together in full view of the town. Eliza felt it immediately, the shift in the air, the way voices softened and eyes followed. She kept her posture steady, her hands folded neatly, though her pulse moved faster than she wanted to admit. Ethan, as always, seemed unchanged by it. "If you'd rather go in alone," he said quietly, "I'll understand." Eliza glanced at him, surprised. "Why would I do that?" she asked. He met her gaze calmly. "Because it would be easier." She considered that. He wasn't wrong. Stepping away now, returning to the familiar space, where she blended into the background, would be easier. But easier didn't feel right anymore. "I think I've had enough of easier," she said softly. For just a moment, something warm flickered in Ethan's expression. "Then we'll go in together," he replied, and they did. Inside, the wooden pews creaked as people shifted, making space without quite knowing why. Eliza could feel the weight of their attention, but something about Ethan's steady presence beside her made it easier to bear. Not gone, just quieter. After the service, the real test began. It always did. People gathered outside in small groups, their conversations carrying a little too clearly across the open yard. "Well, it seems official now. I suppose it wasn't just a passing interest. Still don't understand it, though." Eliza stepped down from the church porch, aware that this was the moment things would either settle or shift completely. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned toward her, his voice calm but clear enough to carry. "I'd like to make something known. he said. The conversations around them slowed, not stop, but close enough. Eliza felt her breath catch. Ethan continued, unhurried. I intend to marry Eliza. The words were simple, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. A ripple moved through the crowd, sharp, immediate, impossible to contain. Eliza stood still, her heart pounding as the weight of his declaration settled over her. He hadn't asked her. First, not in the formal sense, but somehow she understood why. This wasn't a proposal. It was a statement, a refusal to let the town define what they were. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, as always, the whispers began. Some were surprised, some disapproving, some curious in a way that bordered on disbelief, but not all of them carried judgment. A few voices quieter, but steady, held something different. Respect. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. Eliza became aware of how she was standing, her shoulders no longer drawn inward, her gaze no longer lowered. Without realizing it, she had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that erased who she was, but in the way she held herself. As though she no longer needed to apologize for being seen. Beside her, Ethan remained calm, as if he had simply spoken the most natural truth in the world. Eliza turned slightly toward him. You didn't warn me, she said under her breath. I thought you might prefer honesty, he replied. She let out a quiet breath, somewhere between disbelief and reluctant amusement. That's one way to put it. A faint smile touched his expression. I can do things the slower way, he added, just for her, if that's what you want. Eliza studied him for a moment. This man so certain in front of everyone, yet willing to move at her pace when it mattered. No, she said finally. I think this is all right. And she meant it. Across the yard, Clara stood among a group of townspeople, her gaze fixed on Eliza. There was no anger in her expression. Now, only something quieter, more complicated. As the crowd slowly began to shift again, a few people approached carefully, as though stepping into unfamiliar territory. Congratulations, one woman said, her tone hesitant but genuine. Eliza blinked, surprised. Thank you, another followed, offering a small nod. He's a good man, yes, Eliza said softly. He is. It wasn't acceptance. Not fully, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As the morning carried on, the tension that had once defined every glance began to soften, just slightly, because the town was starting to realize something they hadn't expected. This wasn't a passing curiosity. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. And real things had a way of changing people's minds, slowly, quietly, but surely. Eliza stood beside Ethan, no longer at the edge of the moment, no longer waiting for it to pass. For the first time, she wasn't just part of the story, she was helping shape it. And as she looked out at the town that had once overlooked her, she understood something that would have been impossible just days before. They were still watching, but now they were beginning to see. The morning of the wedding arrived softly, wrapped in golden light that stretched across Willow Creek like a quiet promise. For once, the town was awake early, not out of routine, but anticipation. People moved through the streets with a different kind of energy, their conversations no longer filled with confusion or doubt, but curiosity softened by something new. Respect. Eliza stood near the window of her room, her hands resting lightly against the fabric of her dress. It was simple, just as she had wanted. No heavy lace, no elaborate details, but it felt right. Outside, she could see chairs being arranged, flowers set carefully along the aisle, and neighbors gathering in small groups. The same people who had once whispered now worked side by side, preparing for something they hadn't expected, but had come to accept. A soft knock came at the door. Come in, Eliza said. The door opened gently. Clara stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara's gaze moved over Eliza, taking in the quiet elegance of her appearance, the calm confidence in her posture. You look, she began, then paused, searching for the right word. Like yourself, she finished. Eliza smiled faintly. I think that's the best I could hope for. Clara stepped closer, holding something in her hands. I brought this, she said. lifting a small hairpiece, delicate, understated, but beautiful in its simplicity. It used to belong to Mother? Eliza's expression softened. You should wear it, Clara added, if you want to. Eliza hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I'd like that. Clara moved behind her, carefully placing the piece into her hair. Her hands were steady, but her expression held something deeper, something quieter than the admiration she had once known so easily. I used to think days like this were about being seen, Clara said softly. Eliza met her eyes in the reflection. And now? She asked. Clara gave a small, thoughtful smile. Now I think they're about being known. The words settled gently between them, and this time there was no distance. Outside, the gathering had grown. Men in pressed jackets, women in soft-colored dresses. Children weaving between rows of chairs. Willow Creek had come together in a way it never had before. Not just to witness something unusual, but to celebrate something real. Ethan stood at the front, his posture calm, his gaze steady as he watched. The path where Eliza would soon appear, there was no uncertainty in him. No hesitation. Only quiet certainty. When the music began, the crowd fell into a hush. Eliza stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm as she walked down the aisle. Every step felt grounded. Not rushed. Not uncertain. She wasn't walking into something unknown. She was walking into something she had chosen. And as she moved forward, she noticed the faces around her, not with apprehension, but with clarity. The same people who had once overlooked her now watched with something entirely different in their eyes. Understanding. And in many cases, admiration. Clara stood near the front, her gaze steady, a small smile resting on her lips, not forced, not practiced, but real. Eliza met her eyes briefly, and in that moment, everything that had once stood between them felt smaller. Manageable. Healed, in ways that didn't need to be spoken aloud. When Eliza reached the front, Ethan stepped forward. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. No whispers. No expectations. Just truth. You came, he said quietly, a hint of warmth in his voice. Eliza smiled. You didn't think I would? I thought you might take a little longer, he admitted. She let out a soft breath, somewhere between a laugh and something more emotional. I already spent too long standing on the edges of things, she said. I didn't want to do that anymore. Ethan nodded, understanding more in her words than she had said directly. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand speeches. No elaborate promises. Just honest words spoken clearly, without hesitation. When they exchanged their vows, it wasn't about becoming something new. It was about recognizing what had already been growing between them, quietly, steadily, undeniably. And when Ethan took her hand, it wasn't to lead her into something unfamiliar. It was to stand beside her. As an equal. As a partner. Someone who had seen her from the very beginning. When it was over, the silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It was full. Then slowly, it broke into applause, not polite. Not hesitant, but genuine. The town of Willow Creek, once so certain of who Eliza was and where she belonged, now stood in recognition of something they had nearly missed. Not beauty in the way they had defined it. Not worth measured by attention or charm, but something deeper. Stronger. Enduring. As the celebration began and laughter replaced the last traces of doubt, Eliza stepped slightly aside, taking in the moment. For so long, she had believed her life would always exist in the background. Unnoticed. Unchocn. But standing there now, surrounded by people who finally saw her for who she truly was, she understood something that would stay with her long after the day ended. Ethan's choice hadn't just changed her life. It had changed the way an entire town understood what it meant to be worthy of love, and perhaps most importantly, it had changed the way she saw herself. No longer as the sister no one chose, but as the woman who had been worth choosing all along.